When Barron Trump gave up his first-class seat to an elderly veteran, no one anticipated the shocking revelation that would unravel mid-flight. What started as a simple act of kindness turned into an unforgettable moment that left the entire plane in stunned silence. The cabin buzzed with the usual mix of chatter and rustling luggage as passengers prepared for takeoff. Outside, the brisk morning air at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport hinted at the promise of a routine journey, but Flight 247 to Newark was about to become anything but ordinary. Among the crowd of travelers was a young man seated in first class, a face that many recognized immediately, though his demeanor suggested he wished they wouldn't. Barron Trump, now a teenager standing over 6 feet tall, sat quietly by the window, thumbing through a hardcover book. Unlike others in his family, he rarely appeared in the public eye, but the name attached to his boarding pass meant attention was unavoidable. Across the aisle, an elderly man in his late 70s shuffled into the economy section. His silver hair was neatly combed, his back slightly hunched, and his gait deliberate as he clutched his boarding pass in an aged leather duffel bag. Passengers exchanged glances as the man passed by. His military jacket, adorned with faded patches and medals, told a story of service and sacrifice. Some whispered to each other, wondering about his past, while others simply admired the quiet dignity in his stride. He took his seat near the rear of the plane, wedged between a chatty businessman and a restless toddler. Meanwhile, the flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles, ensuring everyone was seated for takeoff. Just as the cabin door closed, a ripple of tension coursed through the air. The elderly veteran's seatmate had become visibly upset, insisting he needed a different seat. As the veteran apologized for the inconvenience, the commotion drew Barron's attention from his comfortable spot in first class. He watched the scene unfold, leaned slightly into the aisle, his brows furrowing in thought. Then, without a word, he pressed the call button for a flight attendant. If you feel like every veteran should be respected, write "Respect of Veterans" in the comment section and subscribe to the channel for more stories. "Excuse me," Barron said softly. When she arrived, he continued, "Can I switch seats with the gentleman in the military jacket?" The flight attendant blinked momentarily, stunned. Passengers in first class glanced up from their newspapers and tablets, their curiosity piqued. The young Trump's offer was unexpected, especially in a world where privilege often went unchallenged. But his expression was earnest, and his tone left no room for negotiation. "Let me check," the attendant replied, her voice carrying a note of surprise as she walked briskly toward the back of the plane. As Barron stood to grab his carry-on bag, the murmurs in first class grew louder. A woman across the aisle leaned toward him. "You don't have to do that, you know. You paid for this seat," she said, her voice tinged with confusion. Barron simply smiled and shrugged. Some people deserve it more. What happened next would change the tone of the entire flight. The flight attendant returned moments later, her expression a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "He said he'd be happy to switch," she informed Barron, her voice carrying a slight tremble. It wasn't every day someone voluntarily gave up a first-class seat, let alone a teenager with a name that turned heads. Barron smiled politely and nodded, grabbing his bag before making his way down the narrow aisle. Passengers whispered as he passed, some nudging each other to confirm what they were witnessing. A few even reached for their phones, subtly snapping photos. Barron seemed unaffected by the attention, his focus solely on the man, now seated near the back. When Barron arrived, the elderly veteran looked up, confused. "Are you sure, young man?" he asked, his voice weathered but firm. "You don't have to do this for me." "I want to," Barron replied, extending a hand. "Thank you for your service. Please take my seat." The veteran hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to accept the gesture. But the sincerity in Barron's eyes was undeniable. Slowly, the man stood, shaking Barron's hand firmly. "Well, thank you. That's mighty kind of you," he said. As the veteran made his way to first class, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A young mother in row 15 whispered to her teenage daughter, "Did you see that? He just gave up his seat." The businessman seated next to Barron looked over, raising an eyebrow. "Never seen anything like that on a flight," he muttered, half to himself. Barron slid into the now vacant economy seat, adjusting his tall frame to fit the tighter space. He seemed completely at ease, ignoring the scattered stares from fellow passengers. A flight attendant passed by and discreetly asked if he needed anything, but Barron simply shook his head and opened his book again. In first class, the veteran settled into the plush seat, visibly overwhelmed by the comfort and unexpected kindness. He adjusted the armrest, his hands trembling slightly. A flight attendant approached him, offering a complimentary drink and a warm blanket. The young man said, "You should have this seat," the veteran explained. The veteran smiled faintly. "It's been years since I've been treated like this," he murmured, glancing back toward the economy section where Barron sat calmly, now absorbed in his book. The gesture had been small in action, but monumental in its impact. For a moment, the cabin seemed to exhale as the tension of boarding dissipated. The passengers settled in, and the plane taxied onto the runway. But as the engines roared to life and the flight lifted into the air, the story was far from over. What seemed like a simple act of kindness was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. And then the veteran spoke. The flight reached cruising altitude, and the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with drinks and snacks, but the atmosphere was anything but routine. Passengers couldn't stop glancing between Barron Trump in the economy section and the elderly veteran now seated in first class. Whispers of admiration had spread, but the story was only beginning to unfold. The veteran sat quietly at first, sipping his water and staring out of the window. His hands rested on his lap, the faintest tremor visible. Then, as if compelled by the weight of the moment, he turned to the passenger seated next to him, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "I have to say something," he began, his voice just loud enough to be heard. The woman looked at him, curious. The veteran adjusted the small pin on his lapel, a purple heart, and sighed deeply. "That young man who gave me this seat, his family saved my life once." The woman's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" The veteran leaned back, his voice growing steadier as he began his story. "It was decades ago, during the Vietnam War. I was stationed overseas, far from home, with no family support. I've been injured badly, shot twice in the leg. When I finally got stateside, I was lost. No direction, no purpose, nothing." His voice wavered, but he continued. "I ended up in New York, trying to rebuild my life. I didn't have a place to stay, barely enough money for food. One day, I ran into a man outside a diner who saw me struggling. He didn't just hand me $1 and walk away. He sat with me and listened to my story. That man was Donald Trump's father, Fred." The woman's eyes widened. "Fred Trump." The veteran nodded, his expression growing wistful. "Yes, he didn't owe me a thing, but he made sure I had a roof over my head and a job to get back on my feet. He never asked for anything in return. He just told me, 'You serve this country, it's the least we can do.' I'll never forget those words." By now, the conversation had caught the attention of several passengers in first class, and the story began to ripple through the cabin. The veteran's voice grew stronger as he continued, his eyes misting with gratitude. "I always wanted to thank his family, but I never got the chance. Life moved on, and I thought the moment was lost forever. And now today, that man's grandson, he's given me a gift I'll never forget." What are the odds of something like this happening? In economy, Barron sat oblivious to the growing buzz around the plane. He was engrossed in his book, his long legs awkwardly tucked into the cramped space. But in first class, the veteran's revelation had sparked something deeper. Passengers began to exchange glances, murmurs of amazement spreading like wildfire. One of the flight attendants leaned toward the veteran. "Would you like me to tell him what you just shared?" she asked softly. The veteran hesitated, then shook his head. "No, not yet. Let the boy have his peace. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me, not right now." But the passengers couldn't contain their astonishment. What had started as a simple act of kindness now carried a sense of destiny, as if the universe had aligned just for this moment. And then something even more remarkable happened. The veteran sat quietly for a few moments, his story lingering in the air like an unspoken challenge. Nearby passengers exchanged glances, some leaning in closer to share their own thoughts in hushed tones. The flight had transformed from a routine journey into something far more profound. It was the man seated directly across from the veteran who broke the silence. He was in his early 40s, with a tired but approachable face. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But your story really hit home. My grandfather served in Vietnam too. He used to talk about how much it meant when people back home cared enough to help. Hearing what Fred Trump did for you, well, that's rare. Too rare." The veteran nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. "It's the little things, son. People don't realize how far a small act of kindness can go. Back then, I thought my life was over. But that man's generosity gave me a second chance." Across the aisle, the young mother chimed in, cradling a sleeping toddler in her arms. "You know, my dad used to say the same thing. He wasn't a veteran, but he always told me that when someone lifts you up, even just a little, you pass it on. It's like a chain reaction. What Barron did today, it's proof that kindness still matters." The veteran's eyes softened as he listened. It's true, and it's not just about big gestures. Sometimes just being seen, being acknowledged can change everything. That's what Fred Trump did for me, and it's what his grandson has done for me again today. The passengers continue to share their stories, each one more heartfelt than the last. A flight attendant, visibly moved, sat on the armrest of an empty seat near the veteran. "I wasn't planning to say anything," she admitted, "but my brother served in Iraq. He didn't talk much about it, but when he came home, he told me that the people who stopped to thank him or help him out in small ways, those were the moments that stuck with him. Sometimes those moments were the only thing keeping him going." The veteran nodded in understanding, his expression a mix of empathy and quiet pride. "Your brother's right. It's the little things that keep you grounded when everything else feels like it's falling apart." In economy, Barron noticed a few passengers glancing back at him, their faces a mixture of awe and gratitude. He didn't understand the full context of what was happening yet, but he offered a polite nod to one woman who smiled at him. His gesture, though small, had set off a cascade of reflections and connections that no one on that flight could have predicted. The veteran turned to the flight attendant and said, "You know, I've always believed that gratitude doesn't just stop with the person who helps you. It grows. Fred Trump helped me rebuild my life, and I've spent every day since trying to honor that by helping others." Today, Barron reminded me of that mission. It's funny how life works, isn't it? The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting everyone slightly, but the mood in the cabin remained steady. The conversations felt like a shared catharsis, as if every person on board was connected by an invisible thread of kindness, gratitude, and human resilience. And just as the plane began its descent, the most unexpected moment of all unfolded. As the plane began its descent into Newark, the conversations in first class quieted. The veteran sat with his hands folded, staring out of the window, deep in thought. Across the cabin, passengers exchanged knowing glances, some still marveling at the unusual turn of events. Just as the captain announced the final approach, the flight attendant who had been listening earlier approached Barron in economy. She knelt slightly to meet his eye level and spoke softly. "I wanted to let you know that the gentleman you gave your seat to shared something extraordinary about your family. Would you like to hear it?" Barron looked up from his book, his curiosity piqued. He closed the cover slowly, the title unreadable to those around him. "Sure," he replied simply, his tone calm but intrigued. The attendant hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Years ago, your grandfather, Fred Trump, helped him when he was at his lowest point," she said. "Your grandfather gave him a place to live and a job, expecting nothing in return. And today, you did something for him that reminded him of that kindness." For a moment, Barron didn't speak. His expression remained composed, but his eyes softened as though the weight of the revelation was settling over him. He finally said, "That's something, isn't it?" The flight attendant smiled. "It is. I thought you should know." As the plane touched down, the veteran stood, preparing to disembark. To everyone's surprise, he walked directly to the economy section, his eyes scanning the rows until they landed on Barron. The young man, now standing to retrieve his bag, looked up in surprise. The veteran extended a hand. "Young man, I wanted to thank you face to face. What you did today, it brought me full circle. Your family has a history of kindness, and you've carried that forward. Never forget how much these moments matter." Barron shook his hand firmly, his voice steady but quiet. "I didn't do anything special, sir. You deserved it." The cabin was silent now, passengers watching the exchange unfold with rapt attention. Some had tears in their eyes, others wore small, thoughtful smiles. The connection between these two men, generations apart, felt like a living testament to the power of empathy and gratitude. As the passengers disembarked, many paused to thank Barron for his gesture. Others approached the veteran, offering handshakes and words of gratitude for his service. At the gate, the veteran turned once more before leaving, tipping his hat toward Barron. "You got a good heart, son. Don't ever lose that." Barron nodded, his usual reserved demeanor softening just enough to show the impact of the words. As he walked toward the baggage claim, he pulled out his phone and typed a brief message. He hesitated, then hit send. The text read, "Grandpa would have been proud of today." This story reminds us that even the smallest act of kindness can create a ripple effect, connecting hearts and changing lives in ways we never imagined. Gratitude, compassion, and empathy, these timeless values unite us and leave a lasting impact. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Let's spread the message that kindness still matters. And for more inspiring tales like this one, make sure to subscribe to Stories Revealed. Join us next time for another unforgettable journey that will touch your heart and spark your imagination.